Okay, here we are. We are going to, this is the 1776 week. We studied Thomas Jefferson on Tuesday. So today I want to focus on our 5,000 year leap as well as our Constitution. We haven't gotten to those in a couple of weeks. So I'm going to go through two of our principles in the 5,000 year leap. And we'll go through, I think we can get all the way through Article 4 today in the Constitution. So that's my goal. I am going to play a little bit with, remember which one's the gain? Bottom or top? Top. Which way am I going? Is it getting louder?
Yes.
Okay. Hopefully we've got some good, hopefully we don't have too much. I can't really hear it. So hopefully we have good volume so you can hear me. And I have the live chat set up if anybody's actually viewing live, so you can chat. If you have a question, throw it up there, and I'll try to watch for that. And we're going to start in our 5,000 year leap. We're going to start on Principle 19. Okay, so you might want to pull that open. And I want to just talk about this principle for a few minutes before going to 20. Now, this one is based in the 10th Amendment, all right? So when the Constitution was ratified, it didn't have amendments, but there were some things that had people concerned about government overreach. They had lived that firsthand with King George, and so they wanted to make sure that they didn't have that experience again. And the only way the people were willing to ratify the Constitution was by this promise of these amendments. And there were a lot of amendments proposed, but 10 were accepted, and we call it the Bill of Rights. So the first 10 amendments in the Constitution are the Bill of Rights. But number 10 says the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. So anything that's not in here saying this is our responsibility stays with the states or with the people, so as not to injure inalienable rights, right? So we should just naturally have. That's the whole purpose of that. And so this principle says only limited and carefully defined powers should be delegated to the government, all others being retained in the people. So we limit them, we define them. If you think about a dictionary, you write down what a word means, and then you know its limitations. Well, when we define their powers, you can do this, 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 and however many things we give to them. Article 1 talked about what our legislators can do, the Congress, the Senate. Article 2 talked about, anybody remember? The president, the executive branch. What's his role? What are the powers given to him? Article 3, judicial. What are our courts allowed to do? And if it's not in there, they're not allowed to do it. And then now we're on Article 4 today, and we'll go through that a little bit too. So only limited and carefully defined powers should be delegated to the government. Limited and defined, very carefully defined, so that they don't overstep and take too much power to themselves. It's exactly what we're trying to avoid. And so anything else is retained in the people. As a people, you have those rights. This was very, very vigorously debated over what are the right limitations for government so that they don't overreach the way we've seen happen in the past. And they were very determined to bind the administrators of government with legal chains in this Constitution. You shall not, right? They've got their own commandments. And the fear of the encroachment of the federal government was the reason that these first 10 amendments came in and why they talked about this so much. A lot of them come back down from the unalienable rights of the Anglo-Saxon freemen, things that they knew. Remember, they didn't necessarily have codified law in the Anglo-Saxons, because they were so well defined and so understood as a people, they didn't have them written down. So we have a couple of amendments here that we want to talk about. The 9th Amendment said the enumeration in the Constitution, enumeration is like a list. The list in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. That takes a little bit of effort to pull it apart. You guys have this page open. It's page 224 if you're following along. And there's all of the wording of the Ninth Amendment. Enumeration of in the Constitution, the listing in the Constitution of certain rights, of whatever rights are listed, is not construed or you don't take that to mean or to deny or disparage others retained by the people. This is not an exclusive list of rights to the people. What's in the 10th Amendment. Okay. And so what that's saying is these aren't the only rights. We've listed a few that we feel very, very strongly about, but they aren't the only ones. Don't assume that everything else belongs to the government. That's what number 9 says. Number 10, the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, we read this a second ago, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states respectively or to the people. Okay? So states had rights as well. And what they felt was if they built these walls or these hedges around their ability to do things, they would have some protection from the federal government. If you were to read Alexander Hamilton Federalist Papers, and this is some tough reading, he has that old language, but he said that power controlled or abridged is almost always the rival and enemy of that power by which it is controlled or abridged. And so they abridged it with the Constitution. They abridged it with states' rights. So certain things were given to the states, certain things were given to the federal, other things were left specifically in the hands of the people. What's the First Amendment? The right, freedom of religion, the freedom to assemble, the freedom, those kinds of freedom of the press. Number 2, the right to bear arms. Those are rights retained in you as people, right? Nobody can tell you which church to join. Nobody can say this is the only state religion. I hope you enjoyed yesterday's video that we watched from David Barton, where he talked about that phrase that's been so bandied about and misunderstood now because they don't take the whole thing, the separation of church and state, which Jefferson meant that the state didn't tell you this is the religion of our country. But people have taken it to mean there can't be any exercise of religion outside of like your home or your church. So it's really been misdefined now. It was not originally. They understood their intent. When you're reading the Constitution, instead of saying this is what I want it to mean, you need to be looking at what was the intent of the founders and why did they put it in there? How did they feel like this was a hedge or a chain or a barrier to make sure your rights were not removed? Because that's really what it is. So that Constitution helps to abridge it. The states' rights versus the federal rights helps to abridge their power. So they have this balance between the federal and the state. And they what you would call it dual sovereignty. So sovereign is a leader, like a king, right? Well, each branch, federal government, state government, they have their areas of sovereignty, the places where they have the right to rule. So those two always standing up against each other is a particular form of protection to you. We don't have that happening now. They're like best buddies. You don't have a federal government to turn to when your state's not doing what it should do. You don't have a state government to turn to when your federal government's not doing what it should do. So you're really kind of stuck because we don't have that right now. We'll talk a minute about why. But the way it was originally balanced, Alexander Hamilton wrote, it forms a double security to the people. It's like having 2 locks on your front door. I've got the regular lock on my door handle, right? But if somebody gets through that one, I got a bigger lock on top. I have a deadbolt. Kind of hard to get through that deadbolt. I got 2 locks on that door. Harder to get through, right? That's what we want. So that power rivaling the power. Power being almost always the rival of power, page 226. The general government will at all times stand ready to check the usurpations of state governments. Now, usurp. Anybody Familiar with that word?
A little bit.
A little bit. What do you know about it?
Usurp, like when you usurp power, you take it from the original owner.
Right. Right. This is mine. Oh, I'm just going to come in and whoop, 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 whoop. So when you look at a war and you have a country that is invading another, they are usurping the power in that country with their invasion. Okay. So these will have the same disposition towards the general government. So the people can say, hey, I'm not getting fair treatment over here. I need your help. Or you're not treating me right. You have a responsibility to protect me. Oh, and I'm getting problems over here. So I need your help. Okay. That was what it was intended to do, is to give them that freedom. Now, originally what happened, if you'll remember when we studied this part of the Constitution, Article 1, that talks about the legislatures, how were senators supposed to be selected originally? Wow, great teacher. Yeah. The state. The legislature in each state chose their 2 senators. Every state has 2. So they're all equally represented at the federal level. Now, what that did, and here's interesting, because they can play with words and they can say to you, well, you're not allowed to pick your senators, so you don't have any power in Washington. True or false?
False.
Why?
Because we're choosing the state government because we
and somebody else at federal level.
President.
And there's 2 houses of legislature.
Oh yeah, the representatives.
House of Representatives, you vote for directly. It's always that way. And that one is set up, if you remember, to be proportionate to the population. So larger populations have more representatives in the House. Smaller populations have less. Everybody gets at least 1. So everybody has some representation there. And the reason they did that was because in the Senate, you each get 2, you have exactly equal representation. So a small state can dictate to a big state there if there's enough small states that disagree with the big states, right? House of Representatives turn the tables. This is the way we take care of that majority-minority problem that we're going to talk about in a minute. And so that in that place, a larger state has a little more power than a smaller state because they have more votes. That doesn't mean everybody from a state votes the same, however, because they are all supposed to vote based on who they represent back home. And House of Representatives has an area within their state that they represent. So what happens to this balance that we have? Because if you've got people who represent the people in the House, people who represent the state in the Senate, you're not going to step on the state's rights, because these people's job, senators' job, was specifically to take care of that state's rights. And if they did something up there that damaged the rights of the state back home, they would be called on the carpet. They'd be in trouble. And so this became an issue because people were confused. They thought, oh, we're not being represented because we're not voting for them. And so the 17th Amendment came through. It was accepted. And what that became was that now state senators are selected by popular vote. Now there's no representation for the state. Those senators are now beholden to the people who elected them, not the state from which they come. All of a sudden, the states have no power in the federal government. That's dangerous. And so now what you see more often than not is states who just line up with what the federal government says because there's a lot of power wielded over them by the federal government and by their people. And that lack of representation has changed a little bit the way funds are appropriated for a state now, because now senators will come home and they'll tell you, look, all these funds I got from the federal government for our state. Those were generally things that were supposed to be handled at the state level in the first place, not by the federal government. If we could turn 17 around, if we could get that one removed, we could probably have some power back in Washington. Now, a lot of state governments have taken the same tack as our federal government, And so it would take some time to get things turned around. But if we could get things back turned around in our states with our local governments and our state governments and get more sovereignty within the states, it produces a natural rivalry that's healthy for the people. Okay? Because now, you know, any money from the federal government isn't the federal government's money. They don't have any money. The only money that they have is yours. It comes from your taxes. And so that is an issue that we continue to face. Now, Article 20 or Section 20, efficiency and dispatch. So things to be efficient, things to happen with kind of a quickness or an ability to move when you need to move. Dispatch required government to operate according to the will of the majority rule. Okay? So whoever has the most votes wins. That's what that means. That efficiency and that dispatch requires government to operate according to the will of the majority. But this is important. The constitutional provisions must be made to protect the rights of the minority. So the federal government generally works on a simple majority, meaning anything over 50%. Okay, if you were to take that and take a look at it, if you have 11 people, 50% is 5.5, which you can't divide a person in half, but 6 people are enough to tell all 11 what the decision is. If 6 people agree, that's what you're going to do. The other 5 have to get in line and go along with that. And that doesn't sound very fair. We'll talk about that minority thing in a minute. Well, we did actually when we talked about the representation in the House, where larger states had a greater majority, as opposed to representation in the Senate, where everyone had equal. And the Senate can veto anything the House does by not passing a law. Remember, if the Senate passes a law, the House has to pass a similar law for it to go to the president. If the House passes a law, the Senate has to pass the same law before it goes to the president. We've taken care of the minority right there. They have as much power in the Senate as anybody else. And so that's what we're looking at for that minority being taken care of. But in the Articles of Confederation, the original Articles of Confederation, before we had the current Constitution, it was to be an absolutely 100% agreement for anything to pass. Can you imagine? I know. Is that possible?
Only with the help of divinely sent.
The hand of providence. It isn't easy to get everybody to agree. I mean, it's near on impossible, unless there's only one person. Sometimes I don't even agree with myself. So I don't know. But with the Articles of Confederation, it required every state to approve of any change. If we need funds over here to General Washington, if one state says no funds to General Washington, you can just starve right there in Valley Forge. We don't care. Okay. One state was all it took to say no. That's all it took. Can you imagine how things would have been at Valley Forge if it had been majority? I'm sure 7 states would have agreed to send funds and food and clothing, but not 13. And so they had difficulties in the war because of that. And that wasn't the only thing, but that's one of the things that just kind of stands out in the war as a very, very difficult and trying time. And something that it just makes you incredibly sad to think of how they lived. You know, we've had flour cakes. They're okay because wheat flour tastes okay. They sure are a lot better with a little salt and a little sugar.
Or butter.
And a little butter, and maple syrup. Because then what do you have? Well, it's a pancake. I can eat pancakes all day long. And so that simple majority is super, super important. And that is that would have changed things in the war. But even during times of just normal, not crisis, just the normal day-to-day management of government, the simple majority is so much easier to work with. All right. Now that's when they go to vote on a legislation. They still have to have 2/3 majority to even talk about a piece of legislation. If the president vetoes a piece of legislation and it comes back, they have to have a 2/3 majority to override the president's veto. So there are times when they don't run by simple majority, important times. But just for that general day-to-day, we're working on the majority because it makes it so that you can actually do something. You're not deadlocked all the time trying to get everybody to agree. Or it's even sometimes been suggested, well, let's go for a 2/3 majority or a 3/4 majority, 75% majority. They're almost as impossible as a complete unison decision. Very, very difficult. And so you have to watch the understanding. Watch the understanding. See, we live here where we live. We have an HOA, a homeowners association. And in the original rules for the homeowners association, it required a 75% majority to change anything in the rules for the homeowners association. State law trumps the homeowners association. State law requires 2/3 majority. Still hard, but much more possible. 2/3 would be 67%. And so when we first moved here, you guys will remember this, the HOA rules did not allow you to have chickens. Well, they hadn't been enforcing their rules, and a good portion of the subdivision had chickens in the backyard. And some of those who wanted to keep their chickens said, okay, we are going to take a ballot around, a petition around, and if we can get enough people to sign it, then we can have our chickens. And they literally went door to door until they had 2/3 signatures of property owners to be able to have chickens. And so it can be done, but it was very painstaking, very painstaking. So now HOA rules have changed. People in this neighborhood can have chickens, 6 of them. Still not as many as I'd like, but that's how many they allow.
Still not many.
This is on camera.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. One of the people, remember, that they would have been studying at the time was John Locke. And we have a statement for him because he talked about this need for a unanimous decision, 100% agreement. He says, it is next to impossible ever to be had, which is what we just talked about. So those 2 times when you need more than the simple majority, initiating an amendment, overcoming or overriding a presidential veto, but that requirement seemed a little bit dangerous when trying to do just normal legislation. So they decided simple majority. Okay. Otherwise, what you've done is you've given a minority greater power. Just think about that for a second. If a minority, if 1/3 or 1/4 has the power to say no, that's a lot of power in the hands of just a few people. And we learn in the Book of Mormon, even when Mosiah is helping to set up their government, he talks about how it's not normal or usual for the majority of the people to want what is wrong. It's always possible for a small minority to want it. But if you do things based on a majority rule, then you don't have that possibility of that small minority who would want wrong to have that power. So it's very important that we have that. Okay, now minorities have equal rights in our country. And the interesting thing about this country, and we've talked about this before earlier in the book, is that everybody was a minority at some point. When we settled Jamestown, who was the minority? The British, right? There's a lot more Native Americans than there were British people. Even white people were at one time a minority in this nation, in the history of it. So everybody's been a minority at some point. And minorities do have things to overcome. If you come and you're the new kid on the block and you don't speak the language, well, the first thing you want to do is learn the language, because learning the language gives you the ability to transact business, know what's going on, to go someplace and not know the language. Oh my gosh, that is, you just sit around going, don't know what's going on.
I hope they're not talking about me.
They might be, but I don't know. Maybe they're going to go string me up in a minute because I can't tell what they're talking about. You just don't know, So it's one of the things you would have to do as a minority moving here. Learn the language, learn the customs, get educated, and, do everything you can do to make yourself in that mainstream because that's super, super important. And just really, become a part of your community. So that ends that one. The majority rule with the minority having rights. And we do have that. So that's important to understand. Okay. That's it for 5,000 Year Leap today. Constitution. Article 4 of the Constitution talks about, anybody remember?
States and their rights.
States' rights. Okay.
Did we go through 19 and 20?
We did 19 and 20 today. I'll take a look at our calendar and see if I need to. I think I'm going to have to at least one more time take care of 2 in a day, which is a lot. I mean, that took 26 minutes to do 2 of them. So we'll see. I think I definitely need to combine 2 of them one more time. But I think one more time will get us back on track. And then Article 4 here is about the states' rights, the states and their rights. And you have 4 sections to it, and it's fairly simple and straightforward, but it needed to be spelled out. Remember, we wanted to have it, just like number 19 said, written out so that we knew what our hedges were, what our borders were. So in the section 1 of Article 4, full faith and credit shall be given in each state to the public acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state. So if you had a state record here, an act, some kind of a record like a birth record, you were born, right? And that's proof that you exist. And judicial proceedings that happen here are accepted by another state. You don't have to have a new driver's license if you cross state lines. Your driver's license is accepted when you go across to another state, unless you're from Idaho, where they allow them to start driving at 14. Yeah, most states will not accept that because that's too young. And I don't know. It's a farming state. I think it's still just as much of a farming state probably as ever. And so it makes sense when if you have a big farm, your children learn to drive early. My dad drove the tractor when he was 5. Okay.
That's really young.
Now it was on the farm. He wasn't going down the road, but he's driving the tractor at 5. You need all of your children to be able to work, to be able to really make a family farm work. Even when we go out and work in our garden, what works best? Mom going out by herself, dad going out by himself, or us just saying, okay, today we're going to go spread mulch. Today we're going to go plant. Today, I mean, how fast does it happen when there's 6 working as opposed to 1 or 2?
Depends on the area we're covering. It could take all day or it could take an hour.
But what if only one person was doing it?
It's always all day.
That would be 6 days. What takes 6 of us 1 day to do takes 1 of us 6 days to do. Right? And so that's kind of that principle for driving in Idaho, is that they're talking about farm. But the acts, records, and judicial proceedings of every other state are accepted or given full faith and credit in each state. The Congress may, by general laws, prescribe, meaning tell you how, the manner in which such acts, records, and proceedings shall be approved and the effect thereof. So Congress can say, okay, you need to accept theirs. It needs to be in this kind of a format so that it's somewhat general across the board, similar. There's things that have to be on a driver's license. There are things that have to be on a birth certificate, a death certificate, a marriage certificate. Not that the state should have anything to do with marriage, but that's another story. And so that way it's a somewhat the same across state lines. Okay. That's all that section 1 is about, is public records and being able to, and acts and judicial proceedings, being able to go from one state to the next and not be like you're in a totally foreign country. Section 2, the citizens of each state shall be entitled to all privileges and immunities of citizens in the several states. Okay. What does that mean? That means if I go to another state, I am not a second-class citizen. They can't treat me differently because I'm not from there. Does that make sense? Okay. So when does that not happen? Well, they can still say, I'm sorry, you're from out of state and state taxes help to pay for this university. So if you come from another state, there is an out-of-state tuition. That's not precluded by this. When we traveled to Montana and we wanted to fish, an out-of-state fishing license, that's a vested right. An out-of-state fishing license costs more than somebody who lives in the state. They're already paying taxes to take care of the waterways and the fishing and all of that kind of thing. So theirs is a slightly different fee. I can still fish. I just have to pay for a different fee. So that is still allowed, but it keeps you from being discriminated against because you're from a different state. Okay, so that's the first paragraph of Section 2, Article 4. But Section 2, second paragraph, a person charged in any state with a treason, felony, or other crime who shall flee from justice, a fugitive, right? So a felony, a crime, or treason, and flees to another state shall on demand from the executive authority of the state from which he fled be delivered up to be removed to the state having jurisdiction of the crime. So if I live in Nevada and I do something wrong and I jump across the border to Utah, it's called extradition or extradite. The governor of that state can say to the governor of this state, you have a fugitive in your state that is guilty of a crime that we need to try them for, or maybe we've already tried them and they've run, they need to go to prison or whatever, there's a fine. Would you please send them back because we have the jurisdiction over that thing, okay? And that is something that has to happen. However, there is a little bit of a responsibility of the governor of the state where the fugitive is. What if I'm being treated unfairly? What if I'm being targeted? What if when they return me, my life is in danger? The governor of this state has the authority and the right, as the governor of his state, to determine if there's a reason not to send a fugitive back. Think of Joseph Smith. How often were they trying to extradite him from Illinois back to Missouri?
All the time.
Over and over and over again. Were they going to treat him with fairness? Was his life safe? Were the charges even true? And that's not what the governor is supposed to, try to determine. But the safety of that person is an important thing for the governor to be aware of before he extradites. And so he has the right as the governor to say, I don't think we're going to send him back. Okay. So that's just one of those things. Article 4, Section 2, third paragraph. Now this one is in your, at least in mine, it's in brackets. And the reason is this is in the original Constitution, but it was changed with the 13th Amendment. But let's see what they put in here originally. And this one has most applies to slavery. Okay. It says, no person held to service or labor in one state under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall in consequence of any law or regulation therein in the new state be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. If I have an indentured servant and they've escaped and gone to another state, if that state has laws against indentured servitude, I have a legal claim in my state. I can reclaim that. Now, do I agree with slavery? I do not. But this really came into play in the Civil War. Do you know how? A lot of your northern states were not slave states. They had the Underground Railroad. If a slave escaped into the northern states, were they free? Did they still belong to the master in the state that they escaped from? We had a little trouble, didn't we? Okay. Like I said, I don't agree with slavery, but the legal rights of the owner, because it was legal, needed to be taken care of. Changed by our 13th Amendment, we no longer have slavery in the United States, at least not in that way. And so I'm very, very grateful for that. Section 3, new states may be admitted by Congress into this union. We started with 13 states, right? 13 colonies, 13 states. They had the vision. They understood that eventually this country would spread. They expected from sea to sea. They even offered to Canada. There was 4 states in Canada that they offered to become a part of the United States. They voted not to, but they offered it to them. That'd be interesting, huh? Eh? They chose to stay their own. That was up to them because we didn't force them into it. But no new state shall be formed or erected within the jurisdiction of any other state. You cannot take Texas and say, Texas, you're too big. We're going to cut a chunk off of you and make a new state. Not going to do it. That's not okay. Nor any state be formed by the junction of 2 or more states. Rhode Island, you're kind of small. Let's just squish you in with that state next door and make one big state out of you. And they are tiny. Not going to happen. Okay? So you're not going to take a part of a state and make it 2 states. You're not going to take 2 states and put them together. Okay? Or any part of a state without the consent of the legislatures of the states concerned, as well as of the Congress. So if Texas said, we're a little large, we're having a hard time handling this many people, we would like to divide into 2 states. Or if Rhode Island and their next door neighbor said, we'd like to have a larger population and have a little more power in the House of Representatives, we would like to become 1 state. They could do that if their state legislature approved it and the Congress approved it. That'd be a hard approval to get from those states, wouldn't it? But any state coming in is going to have the same rights as states already existing. They weren't going to be, we just talked about minority a second ago, they weren't going to be a minority state. If you were a state, you had the same rights as any other state. Okay? The Congress, this is paragraph 2 of section 3, if you're following along. The Congress shall have power to dispose of and make all needful rules and regulations respecting the territory or other property belonging to the United States. All right? What did that just say? Let me make sure I say it right. So the Congress has the right to determine how territorial property is regulated and managed. Okay? New territories that came in were divided into regions. Now think about that thin little border there on the east that was the first original 13 colonies. We expanded with the Northwest Ordinance. We expanded more with the Louisiana Purchase. We expanded more with the Mexican-American War. We got all the way from sea to sea at that point. We expanded more when we bought Alaska from Russia. We expanded a little bit more when the Hawaiian Islands rebelled from, I believe it was the British, and they became a part of us. They became a territory. And the Spanish-American War, we also gained Guam and Puerto Rico as territories. So we've had expansion over the time. Congress has the power and jurisdiction over all territories. Often they're divided up and sectioned, and they would appoint a governor to be judiciary of that territory. And they would continue this arrangement until the population was large enough to justify making an independent state. Okay, so they had some rules for it. And I think the number, if I remember right, I think the number of people they had to have was 60,000 to be able to be a state. Okay. There were some other rules. The Northwest Ordinance helped with that. 6 of the articles. 1, complete freedom of religion had to be allowed in that state. Okay. Basically, you had to follow the United States Constitution. 2, it had to set forth an interesting and comprehensive Bill of Rights, just like all the other states have. 3, it needed to provide for schools where religion, morality, and knowledge would be taught, and provide fair treatment of Indians and their lands. And then Article 4 of that, federal territories and states created, and the states created out of them must forever remain a part of the United States and pay their fair share of the taxes. So you can't become a state and then become your own country or become part of another country. You will forevermore be a part of the United States. Okay. Article 5 of the Northwest Ordinance allowed for the creation of new states. And Article 6, and this one's very interesting, prohibited slavery in the new states. That was supported also by those states that have had slavery. And some of that changed over time because we had the Missouri Compromise, if you'll remember, because that's getting closer to the Civil War. And so the Missouri Compromise was one was a slave state and one wasn't. Kept the balance, right, between slave and non-slave. Okay. Find out where I am here. Okay, so it talked about territory, but also property belonging to the United States. The Congress is responsible for property that belongs to the United States. Planes, trucks, guns, whatever. If it belongs to the United States, they have the right to take care of it. Now, sometimes this has caused a little bit of rift, such as giving away the Panama Canal. Seems a little wrong that they just gave that away, right? It was ours.
Who gave away the Panama Canal?
Congress.
Who to?
Panama. So anyway, that one probably should have been handled differently. Something else that's interesting, this last sentence, nothing in this Constitution shall be so construed, held to mean, or understood as to prejudice any claims of the United States or of any particular state. Remember that when the Constitution was made, there may have been already some things going on between two states or between the government and a state. Any claims that had not yet been settled, this Constitution didn't step over the bounds of. Do you remember talking about that even with some of the legislative stuff? A new law enacted can't be retroactive and affect something that happened back here 3 weeks ago. You can't put me in jail today for something I did 3 weeks ago that you just made a law about. Does that make sense? Same thing here. If we already were working on a claim, this Constitution is not going to make that as if it didn't exist. We will finish all of those things. So that doesn't really apply to us now, but it certainly applied at the time this was being written. Last sentence. Look, we're going to finish in our hour. Section 4. The United States shall guarantee to every state in this union a Republican form of government. Every state was going to have a Republican form of government. What is that? A government of representation of people, representatives elected by the people. So even if that whole state agrees, we want this tyrant, we want a king over our state, you can't. I don't know why anybody would want that. But you cannot agree to something in your state with your constitution and your laws that go against the laws of the Constitution. Has to be in alignment with it. Super, super important. Because if you had a state starting to do that, think Lamanites and Nephites, right? Every time dissenters would head over, or Amlici decides, hey, I want to be king, and he has himself crowned king. It's an issue. Creates wars. People die over these things. It's very, very real, very, very dangerous. And so we have to make sure that every state coming into this federal government under its auspices is still going to have a Republican form of government, because every state has its constitution too. Did you guys know that? Every state has its own constitution for what they do in their state. Has to be Republican. Also, and second point, shall protect each of them against invasion. So here I am. I'm in Utah. What if Nevada gets mad and decides to come and attack Utah? Federal government has a responsibility to protect me from Nevada. What if I'm on the southern border in Arizona and Mexico decides to come in and attack? The United States has a responsibility to protect me from that invasion. Right? Okay. On application of the legislature or of the executive, when the legislature cannot be convened against domestic violence. So between states, between my state and another country. Okay, it's just adding on to what we just talked about. We just finished Article 4. Woo!
And we're early.
And we're early. Any questions? No? All right. I don't know if you guys are watching live and able to chat or not, if you have any questions, but otherwise, anyway, it's easy enough to understand with this book. I love Dr. Skousen, this man. Wow. Thank goodness for everything he did to help us better understand the Constitution, because it has been so stepped on. So stepped on. You saw that yesterday, I hope, if you watched the David Barton video that I sent to you. If you haven't watched it, it's worth it. Turn it on and file your nails or something. I was cleaning doors and windows while it played yesterday. I don't sit very well when I watch things. I'm much better if I can kind of do something and keep myself busy. But turn it on and watch it and just pay attention to what he has to say, because we are a Christian nation. As much as people would like to deny that now, we are a Christian nation. And this Christian nation has the need to, we have the need to honor God, to follow his rules and his laws, which our laws were based upon originally. So we have the need to remember that founding and to stay true to it. We must stay involved. We must remember who we are and keep this knowledge alive. Gain it if we don't have it, which we don't. I don't understand the Constitution completely yet. I'll sometimes get into a little discussion with people, and boy, I'm in really deep, really fast if they know anything, because I just don't know enough. I do not know enough to stand up in a conversation and really defend it. Now, if I'm talking to somebody who knows nothing, well, then I'm controlling the conversation because I know enough for somebody who doesn't know anything to be able to help them understand. But for somebody who's got greater knowledge than me, I'm toast. And I don't like being in that position. So keep studying, keep learning, keep thinking, and let's get this Constitution in our minds and in our hearts. It was ordained by God, and he approved it. And therefore, it's important for us to know and to defend. So next week, we will be talking about 1787 and the Constitutional Convention. A More Perfect Union, put together by BYU. If you can get hold of that and watch it over the weekend, that will really help you with understanding the Constitutional Convention. I will look and see if I can find a link for that and might just make that one of the day's lessons, because it's very, very well done and helps with understanding what was going on with that convention. You guys have seen it. We should probably watch it again, huh? Just to remind ourselves. And Joseph will always be happy if we turn on the television. All right. So any questions here? No? All right. Till we meet again. See y'all soon. I'll find my mouse and end the stream in a second. Okay. Done.